Yland reopened. The game that makes me fondly remember the days of the old era of 2015 to 2016 FNAFB games with an odd charm yet questionable balance by today's standards. A game that masks itself as a Final Mix 1 clone yet offers much more to players who decide they want to do more than the bare minimum. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first part in this review series that I'd like to get started for my channel. Before this review, I had already played this game before the rebalance came out, where constant one-shots were plenty, and there were bugs everywhere. So I knew after the other constant criticisms that other people gave, that I was going to indulge in something that was a lot better. It had that Final Mix feel, although a bit too much so in my opinion. A lot of optional and even mandatory bosses requiring max and fully upgraded gear, along with questionable progression where you could practically ignore all the cameras and instead focus on obtaining max setup within 30 minutes, of which I would say nowadays is a bad thing. However, I can safely say that this is no longer the case, and the game has been rebalanced so that you actually need to fight the cameras in order to upgrade the shops, and the progression of the game overall feels a lot nicer. But before I get into that, today I'm going to talk about what the game does right, what the game does wrong, and how things could be improved. Since this is the first review I'm going to be doing, I'd like to first talk about the order in which I'll discuss each category, and then how I'll be ranking them. So first things first, we'll be starting with the story, then the writing, then the aesthetics, and finally the gameplay. As I expect that to be the full meter of the review, spoilers, be aware. If you plan on playing this for yourself and you don't want to get spoiled on the story, then please skip ahead and the timestamp that I'm going to provide later on in the video. Before I begin, let me introduce the grading system I'm going to be using for this and any future reviews, for those that just want a bit more information. So essentially the grade scale is going to go from 1 to 40. If the game scores a 36 or higher, I give it an S tier. This means that the game is borderline perfect, truly an elite game, although I doubt almost any game will ever get into this category, considering my critiquing for different things and how I prefer my FNAFB games to be done. If a game scores a 30 out of 35, I give it an A tier. Just really good games all around. If the game scores a 23 through 29, I give it a B tier. Good, but with some issues that hold it back. If it scores a 15 to 22, I'll give it a C tier. The game is just okay, but issues may be a little bit more pronounced than I would like. 9 to 14 is a D tier game. Just bad, not unsalvageable, but many problems exist, some of which really detract from the game experience. And then anything lower than that is reserved for especially bad games. I honestly think people would need to try on purpose to make a game this bad. But I feel like most of you probably already know which games would fall under this category. Anyway, with that explained, I'm going to get right into the rest of the review by discussing the story. I'm not going to go overly in-depth in some areas just so I don't accidentally make a 90-minute video with half of it just talking about the story, so I'll be giving a rather brief summary of the events. Let's get started.
いいよ、俺が君のヒーローになれ。
よっしゃ、オッケー。じゃあそろそろ授業始まるから行くね。じゃあね。
じゃあね。
Lala wants to have her own night of debauchery, but Poe decides, fuck it, I'm on the box art, I'm going to be the star of the show this time. They go around, we fight some custards, which are basically the party hat equivalent. We get some party members, Twinkie and Dipsy, and then we go kill the cameras. And once we start doing so, the story shifts from a traditional role to more of a unique-ish approach, where essentially we're looking at the events of the game through a different set of eyes, through different characters, which is something that I can appreciate. It gives a little bit of spice to an otherwise pretty ordinary story, and while I was initially confused on who exactly this interdimensional phone guy was, it wasn't really overly negative, nor did it hamper the experience of the story in any way. This guy really just serves as an interesting plot device. And as we kill more cameras, we get more scenes with them, but they're not overly varied, so each one is a little bit similar to the last scene that we've seen previously.
not available.
Once we kill all the cameras, we see the main bad guy, who is basically a vacuum cleaner, who then vores the night guard, and then we go into the office and we beat the shit out of him. Afterwards, everyone but Poe gets fired, and that's basically the story, at least of the normal route. On the surface, to me, the story is really just kind of a Final Mix 1 clone with some extra scenes added in, and I would say it's serviceable. I mean, considering that the game is basically trying to disguise itself as a FNAFB 1 reskin, I'd say it does it well enough if that's what it was going for. To me, the story, at least in the normal route, is not especially interesting, and it's not really much above the common mediocrity that you would see basically any other old FNAFB game doing, even to this day. We get our party members, we fight the cameras, we go into the office, and then the game's over. That's basically the plot of the normal route. And I'd argue that there's plenty of older FNAFB fan games even that offer a much more intriguing story. And that's saying something, considering most FNAFB games, to me, are not really known for having overly interesting storylines. To me, there isn't really much that you can be invested in. If you choose to do the normal route, you really just find stories like these a dime a dozen. It's the standard FNAFB fare, if you will. However, as you've likely surmised from my wording, this game has multiple endings. The true ending of the game offers much more, although how successful it does that is up for debate. I'm not going to go overly in depth on how to get to the true ending. I'm merely just going to talk about it and discuss what I like and don't like. However, I did see this one cutscene to unlock it that I thought was overly funny. Once we get into the office, that's where the differences start to happen. Once you unlock the conditions in order to get to the true ending of the game, PTLD himself will arrive in front of us. He's essentially the main antagonist of the game, and his reasons for being a big bad guy are revealed in one of the prior flashback cutscenes in order to unlock the true ending. This flashback isn't really overly interesting. He's really just kind of a petty asshole because we treated him badly. He hates debauchery, and now he's trying to eliminate it through the usage of the dream world. He's kind of an analog to BB, I suppose, in that he just kind of hates the party, and he just kind of hates the characters, so he decides to get rid of debauchery completely. After we beat him, we're sent to a dreamy palace of some kind, where we happen to see Golden Freddy. After beating him, we're then thrown into the final area of the game, where we run into PTLD one more time, and then he chooses to run off. We encounter Doremi Sweet, who then requests that we help her in exchange for her giving us access to finally facing PTLD for the last time. There's two different areas to go through, one of which being a FNAFB 2 location, and the other being a sister location type area. We fight some completely random bosses before we engage Gooby Fruby, an ass whose reasons for being here are honestly pretty nonsensical, but it's FNAFB, so fuck it, who cares. I'm not overly convinced on this whole area. It really kind of just feels like padding to make the endgame slightly longer. The extra bosses don't really add anything useful, and they don't really add anything overly interesting story-wise. A lot of FNAFB games have padding at the end, so I'm not really going to take away points for something like this. It just means that there's really just bosses and stuff here that really doesn't matter. Once we finish those two off, Doremi finally lets us go and kick the shit out of PTLD once more. But not before Golden Freddy again decides to fight us once more, of which we completely destroy him with the new skills that we've obtained by entering the dream world. He reconsiders, ditches PTLD, where we finally face the true final boss, where he shows off his new dream powers, completely neutralizing our entire party in the process, and then we're forced into a 1v1 fight, where we have all the skills our allies did, and then Doremi, after we finally beat PTLD, sends us back to reality, and then we go on to watch a Meatloaf concert with Golden Freddy and the phone guy, and then the credits roll. I find the true ending to just be okay. It's serviceable. It's labeled as the awesome ending. I don't really know why, considering the fact that, you know, 3 of our party members just died, basically, and Poe is irreversibly damaged from the fight. I think awesome ending isn't really the correct term for this. It could have just been true ending or something like that, but whatever, I didn't make the game. To me, the ending isn't really emotionally resonating. I don't really feel anything when I experience the story with this game. However, I appreciate that it at least does do more than what most games do for their endings. The problem with it is that PTLD just isn't an overly interesting villain. While we may understand his motivations for why he does what he does, it's not especially convincing enough for the player to care about him. He's kind of just a petty asshole in the game because we just pissed him off one night. As for Golden Freddy, honestly, I couldn't tell you why this guy's here. Even more confusing seems to be the fact that this alternate universe version of Golden Freddy is related to Eve in some regard. Don't ask me how that makes sense because I couldn't tell you. The story is pretty backlogged ultimately, meaning that the vast majority of it doesn't really happen until near the end. It ultimately does very little for it to be very impactful, but it's fine considering what the game is going for. So, I'd personally give the story a 6 out of 10. It's slightly above average, but not by much. I could see people enjoying it, although, to me personally, I'm not really satiated by something like this. In terms of the writing, I would say the writing is quite good. It's not the best I've ever seen, but there are some fairly good jokes here and there, along with the character banner between each of our party members being somewhat entertaining. There's a few typos and grammatical errors, but basically every game has those at some points, and it's not overly common enough for it to be a big deal. It's nothing offensive, it's nothing that's overly confusing, and the Day Shift at Freddy scenes I think have some pretty good writing. Mix that with some standard FNAFB 1 jokes that are changed to fit the setting and characters, and it's good. There isn't really much to say here, but I'd give the writing a 7 out of 10 as well. It's just good. And as I said before in the introductions video, I'm not overly counting humor, as just because I find something funny doesn't mean other people will, and vice versa. And in terms of aesthetics, visually wise, I think the game looks quite nice. It's simplistic, and it's not overly impressive looking, but I'm a fan of the overlay. The character sprites look nice, and the window skin is just nice to look at. Although I'm someone who's kind of always preferred opaque window backgrounds instead of the see-through ones, it's just a personal take of mine. Battlers are good, and just overall, the graphics have no problems at all. It's nice, and I'd rank this a 7 out of 10 as well. It's basic, but it serves the job very well. Gameplay, the meat and potatoes that everyone's curious about. For this category, I'm going to go more in detail, breaking down each of the character's skills and talking about the pros, the cons, and what I would personally change about the game in order to make it a little better. I can accurately describe the gameplay as if you took the greatness of the Persona 4 soundtrack and then you added a bunch of unnecessary shit in order to give it depth that it's not asking for. Let me explain. Overall, I feel like the gameplay in yland is serviceable. It's okay. It's fine. It's nothing overly impressive. It's not terrible, but it's there. However, there is some gameplay mechanics that I think actively detract from the gameplay experience. So I'm going to be taking a look at each of the characters and determining what works and what doesn't. So let's start with Poe. She has some decent damage and some decent utility under her kit. And then later on, if you decide to do the arena and you get the arena skills, Poe becomes an even better damage dealer with the PK arts and having some really good chances for inflicting burns, dots, and other status ailments. Although the utility she brings to the table is a little questionable for me, considering she is one of the only characters to have a active debuff skill in the form of Spooky Tune. The skill itself doesn't do damage, and so I primarily just use Haste Song, which is a very nice speed increase for the party. It's there regardless, but she has some decent things on the table that'll make her worth using, or at least that makes her more than just an item slave. Next we come to Lala, who is essentially the Chica, the Chica from Final Mix 1 for an analogy. She has some useful heals, a decent burn skill and toaster throw, and then a completely useless AoE sleep skill. And let's talk about that one. Lullaby. Here's the problem with it. It always goes last, and it has multi-hit, so it's basically just Freddy's Toreador March, but worse, because at least Freddy could occasionally outspeed random enemies. Here, you don't even get that privilege. The damage is low on it, it has a 3-turn cooldown, and you don't even get the best benefit of sleep, which is preventing the enemy from getting their turn. Most bosses that aren't the cameras have several state resistances, if not flat out immunities to some of these states, so not only will you almost never land the sleep to begin with, but then you're banking on landing sleep with the final hit, of which I have tried and failed several times to do so. It's an okay grinding skill, but outside of that, it's basically just a dead slot. I noticed that there is a distinctive lack of buff removal in this game, and I kind of wish Lullaby had that attribute of having a buff cleansing tool against enemies. It still leaves Lala as that supportive and healer role that she's going for. However, as it stands now, this skill is completely useless, and from what I could tell, it was a lot better before, but then it was nerfed to the ground to the point it's now completely useless. Dipsy, a character that to me needs a rework. He has some decent skills, but it all just feels like a big mismatch. Ends up being really clunky. He wants to inflict ailments, but he also wants to deal high damage and also have some team support. Let me get into more of this. His first skill, which is Custard Shatter, is a multi-hit bleed skill that procs decently well on a lot of bosses, and it's extremely cheap to use. It's a very good skill. And then he just has Foxy's Rushdown, but with a stun chance. Sure, I guess. Once you get the arena skill, in terms of, delusion combo, you won't really be using this much. But effects and usage-wise, it's okay. It's decent. Guitar Smash, a skill that I don't really get the point of. It has an okay silence chance at 20%, but I wish the chance was much higher, considering that the skill costs a lot to use. Silence itself is nearly as good as paralysis and stun sometimes. This could have been a decent skill, but as it stands now, you'll likely never use it. And then you have Reorganize, which is basically an AoE Dispel Dance. It has a very short cooldown. It's good, and I got some uses out of it for some fights. And then we have Sonic Boom. I don't get the point of this skill on Dipsy. Dipsy, so far, all of his skills have to do with status conditions. So give him a skill that makes it easier for both him and his team to inflict status conditions, especially considering that a lot of the late game bosses and a lot of the optional bosses have state resistances. Dipsy could have played more into the status condition inflicting role. So we have a skill here that has a very long cooldown and a very long warm-up. Essentially, this skill is you use it when it comes off of warm-up, and then you go back to waiting for 10 turns just to use it again. However, the damage isn't even insanely high considering the amount of time that you have to wait to use it. And again, as I've reiterated, I could tell Dipsy's meant to be a status inflictor, but I don't really feel that much with him because the state chances just aren't that high on his skills. The lack of regular debuffs and buffs in this game means that there's very few ways for a player to augment their damage outside of states. And I wish we had a better way to help his other teammates inflict their ailments as well. He would be a much more interesting semi-DPS, semi-support character, since the others have more focused roles in healer and damage. I think he needs a rework. Some of his skills could definitely be changed. He does a lot of things, but he doesn't do anything particularly well. And then we come to Twinkie Winkie, who is definitely the best character, I think, overall in terms of having a cohesive kit. He has Custard Slam, which is a decent damage skill with a 23% stun chance. Sure, it's okay. And then he has Spaz Attack, which is one of the only ways to inflict debuffs outside of Poe. It has a very high chance of inflicting a 25% offense down on enemies, and the damage is decent. Although, this skill kind of brings up the problem to me in that there's a lack of regular buffing and debuffing. In the sense that a lot of the buffs in this game come from states and not just the regular RPG maker in ways of inflicting buffs to your party. I understand somewhat why this was done, the fact that you don't want players to just constantly keep buffing their stats, but you can easily change the values on that so it doesn't get out of hand. Next, they have Head Bash, which is basically a multiple times hit with a chance to inflict migraine, which gives enemies MP degeneration. It hits 3 times, the damage is solid. However, migraine isn't really that useful as a state, and there's quite a few enemies that have such high MP that it'll still almost never do anything. But it's whatever, it's not a terrible skill. And then we have Power Gain, which is, again, it's a state for your party that gives us an attack and speed buff. It's essentially like Foxy's Speed Share, but it's better because we also get an attack buff out of it. And then we have Tubby Encore, which is a very high poison chance skill and then great damage. It's great. Poison and dot effects are always going to be strong, at least as long as you give it an actual decent HP degeneration effect, and I have no complaints about the skill overall. Twinkie, to me, is the best from the starting skills alone. He deals damage, he has some support, he has states, and he has debuffs, but the state chances are high, the states are guaranteed in terms of them inflicting on your own party, and the only real problem that I have from him is that none of his skills cost TP, so you just have a dead TP usage on him outside of combo skills that you get if you decide to fight the 2.0 Teletubbies. I'd give maybe a skill here and there an additional higher chance of infliction, but give that skill a TP cost so his TP bar isn't just sitting there most of the time. But that's only the skills from the base kit. We can, as I've alluded to previously, obtain more via optional fights like your usual FNAFB fan game bonus bosses where we get things for fighting them. Another thing to note though, I really would have liked if characters had unique passives. I feel like this is a really good opportunity to just give characters extra effects that give their gameplay a little bit more personality. I don't understand why this game doesn't have them. This is a feature that we've started to see in most modern fan games these days. CC had them, Eve had them, plenty of other games had them. I don't know why this one didn't, but it's not a huge deal, but it's something that I feel like would have been nice to add. The character kits themselves, overall, are okay. They're fine. The only problem I have is with Dipsy because he has, in my opinion, he's doing too much and doing too little at the same time, and his state chances are too low. But the rest of them have decent skills here and there, and they get more good skills later on if you decide to do some optional content that makes them much more cohesive. Speaking of optional skills, basically all of them come from the arena mode. And the arena is where we start to see the cracks come out in terms of the game balance. The first few tiers are fine and well balanced as long as you come prepared with the proper gear and you get rewards for doing so. The platinum tier is where things get a little bit ridiculous in terms of enemies being extremely tanky and them having constant one-shots on your party unless you decide to stat boost. And the rewards themselves across the arena range from good to very bad or flat out useless. The platinum tier rewards I definitely feel like could have been a lot better, considering that some of them are just small max HP and MP buffs, either one skill or elemental resistances that isn't explained very well. And then we have Bonzi here, who is basically just a complete RNG shitfest. I have seen people say that there are strategies for this fight. The strategy is RNG. You're entirely reliant on good RNG. Not only does Bonzi have very high resistances to most of the states in the game, but his luck stat is much higher than any on your party, which means is that you have an even less chance of applying states on him. Not only that, but you have a turn limit, or you're instantly dead if you don't kill him fast enough. Couple that with him having 300,000 health, and you have a frustrating boss, because not only because you can't there are situations where you can't kill him in time, but because he has skills that completely disable or fuck up your entire party for multiple turns. And if that happens, you're basically screwed. It's an RNG fight, and it's one of those where no matter what setup you have, no matter what you do, you're going to get fucked over sometimes, and that's just fact. It's a near guaranteed loss, and you're better off restarting if your team gets paralyzed, put to sleep, etc., etc. He also has a skill that is 7 hits to your entire party. I don't care if it has low accuracy. Someone's going to get fucked over by this. Someone's going to get hit every single time. It's RNG. If your luck is bad enough here, you're going to die. You can't afford to play defensively in this fight either because, again, you have a turn limit. So, to get past it, I had to go into my 2015-2016 FNAFB era bullshit where I basically slammed my head against the wall until RNG decided I could finally win. Burn and dot effects are necessary. Good luck inflicting them with the status rate decreases that he has, and you just have to pray that you don't get fucked over by bad luck. I'm not really sure why he's so much more difficult than the other platinum tier fights. This one is just nearly purely RNG, and not in a good way. And then after we do that, we get an item that gives us full state immunity. If I were you, and you have the intentions of doing the true ending like I did, I'd equip this on Poe, because of particularly the final boss. If not, I would say don't bother. Other than this fight, ailments haven't been anything we couldn't deal with. And then after we finally kill all the bosses in the arena, most of which are well balanced outside of the platinum tier ones, we encounter... holy shit. It's possible, and I guess that's the point if you feel like grinding this battle out for hours, but I'm wanting to get the game finished, so I decided to just leave it alone. The reward completely breaks the balance for the rest of the game, so I'm fine with just leaving it as it is, as I want to experience the actual gameplay and balance as most people would actually experience it for themselves. However, I can definitely say the balance of the arena is much better than it used to be. Bosses are far less of a drag, although in terms of rewards, I definitely think some of them could be a little bit better. As for the bosses in the endgame, some of them are fine and some are just absolutely ridiculous. Nightmare Fuel has this ridiculous fire attack that just puts our entire party to critical health. And then the main problem I have with the endgame is the final PTLD fight. This fight is pure RNG unless you have the Bonzi reward that I discussed earlier. As a solo character, we have to fight him 1v1. However, the problem is that he can stun, confuse, and paralyzes. I don't need to say more on why this is an issue. Good luck if you don't have it though, because bad RNG can just decide that you die and there isn't anything you can do about it. I don't mind this as much if it's on an optional arena fight, as you could just grind those out until you eventually get past it. On a mandatory boss though, this is not so good. And also the fact that he can also just clear most of our health with one attack, so we need to rely on our good old final mix 3 strategy, where we're using an extra large pizza or a full heal every single turn, even if you don't think you need to. We have to play it safe, hope we don't get paralyzed, statused, or confused, and then we have to put our 50% damage shield up, and just then we can get past it. My biggest gripe with the gameplay, as I've likely been alluding to this entire time, is the elemental system. I don't understand why this game has an elemental system, because it doesn't really come into play until late in the game. Not only that, but our characters have 2 weaknesses to elements each. All of our party members have 2 weaknesses, and you wouldn't know that without going into the game files and looking in for yourself. This was just thrown in because they wanted to make the gameplay have a bit more depth to it. But this isn't Molten Freddy's Cleric Voyage, this isn't Innard's Valiant Expedition. Elements only work in longer games. That's just fact, because you need playtime to be able to play more into the elemental system. Your party needs the skills to cover each elemental damage type. And not only that, but we need a scan system. We need to be able to see and memorize what an enemy's weak to and what do they resist. It shouldn't be on the player to memorize 8 different elements, and for the sake of this I am exaggerating a little bit because there isn't that many elements in this game, but you guys get my point. There's no scan to check what enemies are resistance are weak to. There's no way to see what our party members are weak to outside of going into the game files, and some skills we have no clue what element they are because the icons don't help. Like BTFO. This skill is sound element, by the way. Would you know that without me telling you? No, you wouldn't know that. How is the player supposed to figure this out without looking into the game files? We just occasionally take more damage from some attacks sometimes. And 3 of our fucking party members just have 2 weaknesses, with only a 10% resistance to 1. Can we not get an item or something that informs us of what these elements are? The elemental system is just never really explained for this game, which nearly confirms to me that this is an addition that was added very late into the development cycle. The element system only plays a part for some of the fights in the arena, and if you decide to do the true ending or not. If you do the normal ending and you don't do any of the optional fights, it's basically not even there. And outside of those areas, it serves zero purpose. I don't understand why it's here, because it doesn't add anything to the gameplay. The Golden Freddy fight, yes, there are elemental shields, but you can just brute force that. It doesn't feel naturally integrated to me. This game isn't like the games I've mentioned previously where each of our characters have 15 to 20 plus skills, so we can get around some of our options being cut off. We have a limited skill set that gets restricted even further depending on the fight. The elemental system here is like if you gave a job a resume, but you only put your name and address on it and didn't actually fill the details in. It's barely had time to cook at all. The game could have done completely without the elements, and nothing really would have changed. You can't even play around it with interesting ways like damage resistance outside of the Mechasonic reward, and damage amplifying like the Eve break skills and some of the equipment from that game that increases our elemental damage. It's just kind of there. It's not horrible, I just don't see the purpose in it. All it really serves to do on some of the later fights is just decrease the amount of viable skills that we can use on the bosses. Couple that and the fact that there's basically no way for our party members to be able to shore up their weaknesses, and then we have a problem. But outside of the elemental system, there's also a few things with the boss fights that I think make them a little boring. Most of the cameras have practically no gimmick outside of just summoning mook enemies for us to kill, and where we just spam AoE attacks. I would have appreciated some attempt to make them more than just double attack, triple attack, poison, confusion lens. You get my point. I get the game is disguising itself as a Final Mix 1 clone analogy thing, but that's not a valid reason for why we can't improve on the base formula. In this day and age, cameras should have a bit more thought into them instead of just being copy-pastes with slightly higher stats and an extra lens skill added on top. And that's sort of just my complaint with most of the enemies in general. Most of them don't have gimmicks. Most of them don't have anything overly interesting about them. A lot of them just feel like blanket reskins of each other with some additional skills tacked on, and that's about where it ends. But the gameplay isn't just battles. I like the inclusion of quality of life features like not being able to be ambushed, being able to run from every encounter, and healing on level up. These are all just very nice quality of life additions to have. Shops updating through each era so we don't have to go to a very specific shop in order to find what we need is good. There's cool things and there's secrets to occasionally interact with, and all in all, I never really got that bored with the game outside of some particularly tanky fights and the padding towards the end when I just wanted to finish it. Although I do wish the cameras would have had a little bit more effort put into them. The Tubbypedia is honestly just a nice personality thing to look at. It's pretty cool reading information on enemies and bosses that we've defeated, and it reminds me of common monsterpedias or encyclopedias that we've seen in actual RPG games where we can view information on stuff that we've seen in the world. It doesn't really add anything particular to the value of the gameplay itself, but I like the inclusion of it regardless. It gives it a little bit of charm that I always appreciate. And I would say overall, the balance is fine. There are one-shots, and there is some jank in the late game that we'll have to deal with, but mandatory bosses wise, it's fine. And I've definitely seen worse. The only mandatory boss that we'll likely have to try a bunch because of that RNG is the final boss in the true ending. But that's only one fight, and then the arena being completely optional. And at the end of the day, if you're struggling, we can always just grind and use stat boosts anyway. So at least we don't have the problem of getting soft locked. I'd give the gameplay a 6 out of 10. It feels a bit too much like a Final Mix game for my tastes, and there's still some jank and clunkiness here. I hate the inclusion of the elemental system, as it was not done well enough at all. Final score, 26 out of 40, a B rating.
Too easy. Piece of cake.
If you're someone who's wanting an older game feel while giving us some quality of life options, good dialogue, and decent balance, albeit a poorly done elemental system inclusion, then I suppose I can't really recommend the game well enough for you. It's got a classic appeal that I know some people are a fan of, although it doesn't really satiate my taste personally. If you want a game that is extremely innovative and has new, unique, and complex mechanics, I'd look elsewhere. I find the game good regardless though. It doesn't hit all the right spots for me, but for some people, they don't need complication, and they don't need unique and wildly out there mechanics. For some people, simple is just how they like it. And if you want that with an okay plotline, then go ahead and play it. I'd say you'd get some decent enjoyment out of it.